Sometimes the hardest part of being a parent is knowing you can't give your child the life they deserve. Richard Brenner felt that weight every day after he lost everything. At 54, widowed and jobless, he bought a condemned house for $100. It was all he could afford. The place was falling apart, broken windows, sagging roof, floors you couldn't trust. But it had 4 walls, and that was more than they had. His 11-year-old son, Caleb, never complained. The boy had learned not to. When they pushed open the front door that first afternoon, they expected dust and decay. What they found instead froze them both in place. 5 small children sat huddled against the wall, dirty and terrified, staring back at them in silence. How long had they been there, and where were their parents? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Richard Brenner hadn't always been a desperate man. 3 years ago, he'd been someone different entirely. A man with a steady paycheck, a mortgage on a modest 2-bedroom house in the suburbs, and a wife who made every room brighter just by being in it. Louise had been the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table even when money was tight, who could make a Tuesday night dinner feel like Thanksgiving. The cancer had taken 18 months to kill her, but it had taken less than 6 to destroy everything they'd built together. Richard had good insurance through the factory, or so he'd thought. The fine print had been less generous than the promises. Experimental treatments weren't covered. The clinical trial that gave them 3 extra months with her had cost $40,000. The funeral had been simple, but even simple wasn't cheap. He'd sold the house to pay the medical bills, moved himself and Caleb into a cramped apartment on the east side of town, the kind of place where the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbor's arguments, and the parking lot lights flickered all night. But it had been home. They'd made it work. Then the factory closed. 23 years Richard had given to Riverside Manufacturing. 23 years of overtime shifts and holiday bonuses that kept getting smaller. When the announcement came down that they were moving operations to Mexico, Richard had known what it meant. At 54, he was too old to start over and too young to retire. The severance package had been insultingly small. 3 months of his salary, as if that could replace 2 decades of loyalty. He'd stretched it as far as it would go, applying for every job he could find. But the manufacturing sector in their region had collapsed, and the service industry wasn't interested in hiring a middle-aged man with a bad back and no college degree. The eviction notice had come on a Tuesday. 30 days to vacate. Caleb had found it on the kitchen counter when he got home from school. The boy hadn't said anything, just looked at his father with those quiet, understanding eyes that no 11-year-old should have. That's when Richard had started looking at the county auction listings. The house at 412. Sycamore Street in Meadowbrook had caught his attention because of the price. $100 cash only as a sale. No inspection, no warranty, no guarantees of any kind. The listing had been brutally honest. Condemned property, structural damage, not suitable for habitation. The photos showed a place that looked like it had been abandoned mid-collapse, but it was a roof. And Richard had exactly $247 left in his checking account. The county clerk's office in Meadowbrook was a small, tired building that smelled like old coffee and photocopy toner. Beverly, the woman behind the desk, had looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and resignation when he'd come in with his $100 in cash. "You know that place is condemned, right?" she'd said, not unkindly. "The county's been trying to get rid of it for 2 years. Had some trouble out there. Previous owner died, no heirs came forward. Place sat empty, got broken into a few times." "What kind of trouble?" Richard had asked. Beverly had shrugged. "Just talk, mostly. You know how small towns are. People see lights in an empty house, they start telling stories. Sheriff's department checked it out a few times. Never found anything." Richard had signed the papers. The drive to Meadowbrook had taken 90 minutes, through countryside that had once been prosperous farmland and was now mostly abandoned fields and shuttered businesses. Caleb had sat in the passenger seat of their old truck, watching the landscape roll by with the same quiet patience he brought to everything these days. "Dad," Caleb had finally said about 20 minutes outside of town. "Yeah, buddy. Is it going to be okay?" Richard had wanted to lie. Wanted to say yes, of course, everything would be fine. But Louise had taught him better than that. She'd always said children could smell a lie from a mile away. "I don't know," Richard had said. "But we're going to try our best to make it okay. That's all we can do." Caleb had nodded and gone back to looking out the window. Meadowbrook itself was the kind of town that time had forgotten. Main Street had more empty storefronts than open ones. The grocery store was still operating, along with a post office and a diner that looked like it hadn't updated since the 1970s. Sycamore Street was on the eastern edge of town, where the houses thinned out and gave way to overgrown lots. Number 412 sat at the end of a cracked driveway, partially hidden behind a wall of weeds that had grown as high as the windows. Richard had pulled the truck to a stop and just sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, taking it in. The house was worse than the photos had suggested. It was a small, single-story structure, probably built in the 1950s, with what had once been white siding now grey with age and neglect. The roof had a visible sag in the middle. Two of the front windows were boarded over with plywood that had warped from weather exposure. The third window was broken, jagged glass still clinging to the frame. The front porch listed to one side, its support posts rotted at the base. "This is it?" Caleb had asked quietly. "This is it," Richard had confirmed. They'd sat there for another moment, father and son, looking at what $100 could buy when you had nowhere else to go. "Well," Richard had finally said, opening his door, "let's see what we're working with." The front door was unlocked, the knob turning easily in Richard's hand. He'd felt a brief flash of concern. Someone could be inside, but desperation had overridden caution. "Stay close," he'd told Caleb. The door had stuck in the frame, swollen from moisture, but a firm push had sent it swinging inward with a shriek of rusted hinges. The smell had hit them first, damp and rot and something else, something that suggested recent human presence. The interior was a single open space that had once been divided into a living area and kitchen, with a hallway leading back to what Richard assumed were bedrooms. The floor was littered with debris, empty cans, torn newspapers, fast food wrappers. Water damage had left dark stains on the ceiling, and then Richard had seen them. 5 children huddled against the far wall near the hallway entrance. So still and quiet that for a heartbeat he'd thought they were mannequins, some kind of sick prank. Then one of them blinked. Richard and Caleb had frozen in the doorway. The children hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. They were just there, sitting against the wall in a tight cluster, staring with wide, frightened eyes. The oldest looked to be about 9, a girl with matted dark hair and a face smudged with dirt. She had her arms around 2 younger children, twins from the look of them, boys who couldn't have been more than 6. Another girl, maybe 7, sat pressed against the oldest girl's side. And tucked into the smallest space in the center was a little boy, 4 at most, his thumb in his mouth. They were wearing mismatched clothes, shoes that didn't match, no socks. Their faces were gaunt, cheekbones sharp under the grime. But it was their eyes that hit Richard like a physical blow, the desperate, hunted look of prey animals, trapped in a corner. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Richard's mind was racing. Children in his house, in this condemned, forgotten place. How? Why? How long had they been here? Richard took a slow, careful step into the house, holding up one hand in what he hoped was a calming gesture. The floorboards creaked under his weight, and all 5 children flinched at the sound. "My name is Richard," he said quietly. "This is my son Caleb. We just bought this house. We didn't know anyone was here." The oldest girl's jaw tightened. Her arms pulled the younger children closer, if that was even possible. She looked like she was trying to decide whether to run or fight, calculating odds that no 9-year-old should have to consider. Richard's eyes swept the room more carefully now, looking past the debris to the signs of habitation. In the corner, near where the children sat, he could see evidence of a makeshift camp, a pile of blankets that looked like they'd been scavenged, several empty food cans stacked in a crude pyramid, a plastic bucket that he realized with a sinking feeling was probably serving as a bathroom. "How long have you been here?" he asked. No answer. The oldest girl's eyes were locked on him, tracking his every movement, protective, terrified, defiant. Beside him, Caleb shifted. "Dad, they're scared." "I know. They look hungry." Richard looked at the children again. Caleb was right. Beneath the dirt and fear, he could see the signs, the hollow cheeks, the way their clothes hung loose, the grayish tint to their skin that spoke of malnutrition. "We have food in the truck," Richard said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Crackers, some granola bars, water bottles. Would you like some?" The little one in the center, the 4-year-old with his thumb in his mouth, shifted slightly. His eyes flickered toward Richard, then away, then back. Want and fear warred in his expression. "Caleb, go get the cooler from the truck. Bring the crackers and the water. Move slow, okay?" Caleb backed toward the door, never turning away from the children. The door creaked as he slipped outside. Richard stayed where he was, not moving closer, giving the children space. He needed to call someone, police, social services, somebody. These children were clearly in trouble, clearly abandoned or lost or worse. But something stopped him from reaching for his phone. Something about the way the oldest girl was looking at him, the desperate protectiveness in her posture. The front door creaked again, and Caleb came back in, carrying their small cooler. He set it down just inside the doorway, then looked at his father questioningly. "Open it. Take out the crackers and water. Put them on the floor, then step back." Caleb did as he was told, moving with careful deliberation. He placed a package of saltine crackers and 3 water bottles on the dusty floor, then retreated to stand beside Richard. The children stared at the food. Nobody moved. Then Caleb did something Richard hadn't expected. The boy walked past the food, slowly, and sat down on the floor about 6 feet from the children. Not close enough to threaten, but close enough to seem less intimidating than standing. He picked up the crackers and opened the package. "These are pretty good," Caleb said conversationally, taking one out and eating it. "My mom used to give them to me when my stomach hurt." He placed the open package on the floor and pushed it toward the children. "You can have them." "We have more in the truck." The 4-year-old watched Caleb with intense focus. His thumb slipped from his mouth. His eyes moved from Caleb's face to the crackers and back again. "It's okay," Caleb repeated, his voice soft. "I know what it's like to be hungry." That simple admission seemed to break something. The little boy's hand crept out from the protective circle of the older girl's arms. His fingers stretched toward the crackers, trembling. The oldest girl made a sound, not quite a word, but a warning. The little boy froze. "Iris," one of the twins whispered. It was the first word any of them had spoken. "Please." So the oldest girl was Iris. Richard filed that away. Iris looked at the crackers, then at Caleb, then at Richard. Her face was a mask of calculation and exhaustion. Finally, she gave a tiny nod. The little boy's hand darted out and grabbed a cracker. He stuffed it into his mouth, chewing frantically. Within seconds, all 5 children were reaching for the food, trying to maintain some semblance of order, but clearly starving. They passed the crackers around with practiced efficiency, making sure everyone got some. The oldest girl took the least, Richard noticed, making sure the younger ones ate first. Caleb unscrewed one of the water bottles and set it down closer to them. The little boy grabbed it and drank deeply, water dribbling down his chin. He passed it to one of the twins, who passed it to his brother, who handed it to the 7-year-old girl. Richard watched this choreography of survival and felt something crack open in his chest. These children had been taking care of each other, living in squalor, terrified and abandoned, but still functioning as a unit. "What are your names?" he asked gently. Iris looked up from her cracker. Her eyes met his, and for a moment Richard saw past the fear to the person underneath, a child who'd been forced to grow up too fast, who'd carried a burden no child should carry. "Iris," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't used it in a while. She pointed to each of the others in turn. "Brooke, Tyler and Trevor, Simon. How old are you, Iris?" 9, and the others. "Brooke is 7. The twins are 6. Simon just turned 4. Where are your parents?" Iris's face closed down again, shutters dropping behind her eyes. Gone. Gone where? Just gone. Her voice was flat, final. Richard knelt down slowly, bringing himself to their level. Iris, we need to get you help. You and the others. You can't stay here like this. No. The word came out sharp, panicked. No police. No foster care. They'll split us up. You need food, medical attention, proper shelter. We stay together. Iris's voice rose, and the younger children pressed closer to her. We don't get separated. That's the rule. Whose rule? Iris didn't answer. She just stared at him with those two old eyes. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out something, a small, worn notebook with a tattered cover. She clutched it against her chest like a shield. What's that? Richard asked softly. Nothing, Iris said. But her grip tightened on it. Richard could see writing on the cover, faded and smudged. He didn't push. Instead, he sat back on his heels, thinking he should call the authorities. That was the right thing to do, the legal thing. These children needed help beyond what he could provide. He was a broke, unemployed widower with barely enough resources to feed himself and his own son. But he looked at them, really looked at them, and saw Caleb, saw what his son might have become if Louise had died and Richard hadn't been there. Okay, he heard himself say. Okay, we'll figure this out. But first, you need real food and water. And we need to make sure none of you are hurt. We're not going anywhere, Iris said fiercely. I know. I heard you. We stay together, Richard stood up. Caleb, help me unload what we can from the truck. We're going to need to set up something livable for tonight. Dad? Caleb looked up at him, confusion and hope mixed on his face. We're staying? We're all staying, Richard said. At least for tonight. Then we'll figure out what comes next. As darkness fell over Meadowbrook, Richard and Caleb worked to create something resembling safety in that broken house. They set up their camping lantern in the corner. Richard tested the water. The pipes were dry. They'd have to use bottled water for everything. The electricity was shut off. They'd be living by lamplight. The children watched every move they made. When Richard brought in their sleeping bags, Simon's eyes went wide. When Caleb unpacked a small bag of apples, Brooke made a small sound of longing. Here, Caleb said, offering her one. It's okay. Brooke took the apple with both hands, cradling it like something precious. She bit into it carefully, and tears started running down her cheeks as she chewed. Richard turned away, his throat tight. Whatever had happened to these children, whatever had brought them to this place, it had been bad. Very bad. That night they all slept in the main room. Richard didn't trust the back of the house yet. Didn't know if the floors were sound, if the walls were stable. The 5 children huddled together on one side, refusing to separate even now. Caleb spread his sleeping bag near them, a bridge between the two groups. Richard took the spot closest to the door, positioned so he could see everyone. Before sleep took him, Richard heard Iris whisper to the others, so quietly he almost missed it. It's okay. Just for tonight. She'll come back, she promised, and Richard understood. They were waiting for someone who'd left them here with a promise to return. The question was, would that person come back to help them or to make everything worse? Richard woke to the sensation of being watched. Pale morning light filtered through the broken windows, painting streaks across the dusty floor. He opened his eyes slowly and found all 5 children staring at him from their huddle across the room. They hadn't moved from their spot all night, hadn't made a sound. It was the kind of stillness that came from practice, from learning that being noticed could be dangerous. Good morning, Richard said quietly, sitting up. His back protested. Sleeping on the floor at 54 wasn't what it used to be. Caleb was still asleep beside him, one arm thrown over his face. None of the children responded to his greeting. They just watched. Richard got to his feet slowly, making his movements deliberate and unthreatening. I'm going to go into town for supplies. Food, water, things we need to make this place livable. I'll be back in an hour, maybe 2. Iris's eyes narrowed. You're leaving? Just to the store. We need food. Real food, not just crackers. He paused. Caleb will stay here with you. Is that okay? The children exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Iris nodded once, sharp and wary. Richard gently shook Caleb awake. The boy blinked up at him, momentarily confused, then remembered where they were. He sat up quickly, looking over at the children. "I need you to stay here while I go to town," Richard said quietly. "Keep an eye on things. Don't try to make them do anything they don't want to do. Just be here, okay?" "What if something happens?" Caleb whispered. "Nothing's going to happen." "I'll be back soon." Richard squeezed his son's shoulder. "You'll be fine. They're just scared." The drive into Meadowbrook's small downtown took 10 minutes. Richard's mind churned the entire way, trying to figure out what to do. The right thing would be to call Child Protective Services. These children were clearly abandoned, clearly in need of help beyond what he could provide. But Iris's words echoed in his head. "They'll split us up." Richard knew what that meant. He'd seen it happen to a cousin's kids years ago. The system didn't have enough foster homes willing to take sibling groups, especially not 5 children at once. They'd be separated, sent to different homes, maybe different counties. The bonds they'd formed, the way they protected each other, the way Simon clung to Iris like she was his lifeline, all of that would be torn apart. The general store sat on Main Street, a squat brick building with faded lettering that read Sutton's Grocery and Sundries. Richard pushed through the door, triggering a bell that jangled overhead. The woman behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle. She was in her 60s, grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. Her nameplate read, "Diane." "Morning," she said, studying him with open curiosity. "You're new. Just moved in. Bought the place on Sycamore Street." Her eyebrows rose. "The condemned house?" "For $100. "That's the one. Well," Diane set down her pencil. "You're either very brave or very desperate." "Which is it?" Richard found himself almost smiling. "Can't it be both?" "I suppose it can." She gestured around the store. "What do you need?" Richard grabbed a cart and started filling it with essentials. Rice, beans, canned vegetables, bread, peanut butter, powdered milk. Things that would stretch and last. His budget was painfully limited. He had maybe $140 left after buying gas for the drive. Every item required calculation. Diane watched him pile generic brands and bulk items into the cart. When he brought it to the counter, she started ringing things up, her expression thoughtful. "Just you out there?" she asked. Richard hesitated. "My son, Caleb, he's 11. "Uh-huh." Diane scanned a bag of rice. "Big grocery order for just 2 people. We eat a lot." "Right." She didn't sound convinced. "You know, I grew up in this town. Been running this store for 30 years. I know when someone's carrying a secret." Richard's hands tightened on his wallet. "I'm not—" "Relax," Diane waved a hand. "I'm not asking. Everyone's got their business. But if you need help, there are people here who remember what community means. This town's had its share of hard times. We look out for each other." The total came to $87 and change. Richard counted out the bills, trying not to think about how little would be left. Diane bagged his groceries in silence, then paused before handing them over. "That house has a history, you know." Beverly at the county office mentioned something. "About 2 years ago, a family lived there. Woman and her kids. Things weren't good. Neighbors heard fighting, saw bruises. Sheriff's department got called a few times." Diane's voice went quiet. "Then one day they were just gone. House sat empty after that. County took it for back taxes." Richard felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What happened to them?" "Nobody knows. They just disappeared." Diane handed him the bags. "But every now and then, someone would see lights in that house late at night. Sheriff would check it out, never find anything. Then the county condemned it, and everyone stopped paying attention." Richard loaded the bags into his truck, his mind racing. A woman and her kids, fighting, bruises, then gone. When he pulled back up to the house, he saw Caleb sitting on the porch steps with Simon. The little boy was pointing at something in the weeds, and Caleb was nodding, listening with the kind of patient attention that made Richard's chest tight with pride. The other 4 children were visible through the broken window. Still inside, still wary, Richard carried the groceries in and found Iris standing guard just inside the door. She looked at the bags with barely concealed hunger. "I got food," Richard said. "Real food. We're going to make breakfast." Over the next hour, using the camping stove they'd brought, Richard heated up canned soup and made peanut butter sandwiches. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling. The children ate like they couldn't believe the food was real, like it might disappear if they looked away. Simon sat next to Caleb, mimicking the way the older boy held his spoon. Tyler and Trevor ate in perfect synchronization, as if even their chewing was coordinated. Brooke hummed while she ate, a tuneless melody that seemed to calm her. And Iris ate last, only after making sure everyone else had enough. "Cyrus," Richard said carefully, once everyone had finished. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up, guarded. "How long have you been in this house?" She was quiet for a long moment. 3 weeks, maybe 4. I'm not sure anymore. And before that, different places. Moving around. Her voice was flat, reciting facts. "Mama said we had to keep moving. Said someone was looking for us. Who was looking for you?" Iris's jaw tightened. She glanced at the younger children, then back at Richard. "Can we go outside?" "I don't want them to hear." Richard followed her out to the porch. The morning sun was warm, the air still cool. Iris wrapped her arms around herself and stared at the overgrown yard. "There was a man," she said finally. "Mama's boyfriend. He was mean. He hurt us sometimes. Hurt Mama too." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she was discussing the weather. "Social services came to check on us. Mama knew they were going to take us away, so she ran. Brought us here. Said she had to go get money, find us a safe place to live. Said she'd be back in a few days, but she didn't come back. Not yet." Iris pulled the tattered notebook from her pocket. "But she left this." She wrote a note. She opened the notebook to the first page. In messy, hurried handwriting, someone had written, "Keep them safe. I'll come back. I promise. Stay together. Don't let anyone separate you." Richard stared at the words. A mother's desperate instruction to a 9-year-old girl. A promise that was now 3 or 4 weeks overdue. "Iris," he said gently, "your mother might not be able to come back. She might be in trouble. Or she's coming back." Iris's voice was fierce. "She promised. She's just late. She's been late before." Richard looked at this child who'd kept 4 younger children alive for weeks on scraps and willpower, who'd followed her mother's last instruction with the kind of devotion that broke his heart. "Okay," he said. "But in the meantime, you need help. You all do. And I'm going to try to give it to you. Just until your mother comes back. Deal?" Iris studied his face for a long time. Then slowly she nodded. "Deal." 3 days passed, in a strange rhythm of survival and uncertainty. Richard worked to make the house marginally more livable, sweeping out debris, boarding up the broken window with scrap wood, testing floorboards to see which ones were safe to walk on. The children watched his every move with cautious curiosity, slowly beginning to accept that he wasn't going to hurt them or send them away. Caleb had become their bridge to normalcy. He taught Simon how to tie his shoes properly, showed the twins a hand-clapping game Louise used to play with him, sat with Brooke while she hummed, never asking her to stop or be quiet. The children responded to him in ways they wouldn't with Richard, less guarded, more willing to smile. On the 3rd afternoon, Brooke found something while exploring the edges of the main room. She'd been running her hands along the floorboards near the hallway when one of them shifted. She pulled it up with a creak, revealing a dark gap beneath. "Richard." Her voice was small, uncertain. It was the first time she'd said his name. Richard came over, kneeling beside her. "What did you find?" She pointed into the gap. Something glinted in the shadows. Richard reached in carefully and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished and crusted with dirt. The chain was broken. Iris appeared at his shoulder immediately, eyes wide. "Where did that come from?" "Under the floor," Brooke said. "Is it treasure?" Richard turned the locket over in his hands. It was old, but not antique, maybe 20 or 30 years. He carefully pried it open. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, the kind you'd get from a photo booth. One showed 5 children arranged by height, Iris, Brooke, Tyler, Trevor, and Simon, though they looked younger, cleaner, happier. The other photo showed a man's face, but someone had scratched it out deliberately, scoring deep lines through the image until the features were unrecognizable. Iris sucked in a sharp breath. "That's us. From before." Her hand reached out, hesitant, then pulled back. Mama had that. She wore it every day. Do you know who the man was? Richard asked carefully. Iris's face went dark. Him, the boyfriend. Mama scratched his face out after we left. She said she never wanted to see it again. Richard studied the scratched photograph. The violence of it, the deep gouges torn through the paper, spoke of rage and pain. He closed the locket gently and handed it to Iris. I think this belongs to you now. She took it with both hands, cradling it like something fragile. If Mama's locket is here, that means she really was here. She really did bring us here and then leave. It looks that way. Iris's face crumpled for just a moment before she pulled herself back together. 9 years old and already an expert at swallowing grief.
She'll come back.
She has to. That evening, as Richard heated up beans and rice on the camping stove, there was a knock at the door. Everyone froze. The children's eyes went wide with fear. Iris immediately pulled the younger ones behind her. Richard held up a hand. "Stay here." He approached the door slowly, heart hammering. Through the warped glass, he could see an old man standing on the porch, hands in his pockets, looking more curious than threatening. Richard opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" The man was probably in his 70s, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He wore work clothes that had seen better days and a baseball cap with a faded logo. "Name's George. I live next door." He gestured to a small house barely visible through the overgrown hedge. "Saw you moving in a few days back. Thought I'd come by, see if you needed anything." "We're managing," Richard said, not opening the door any wider. George's eyes flicked past him into the house. Richard knew what he must have seen: the camping gear, the minimal supplies, the shadows of children trying to hide in the back. "Look," George said quietly, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I've lived next door for 40 years. I know this house's history. Know a woman was living here with some kids a while back. Then they vanished." He paused. "About 3-4 weeks ago, I saw lights here again. Late at night. Heard children's voices. Then nothing. Until you showed up." Richard's grip tightened on the doorframe. "I don't know what you think you saw. I think you found some kids that needed help." George's voice was gentle. "And I think you're trying to do the right thing, but you're in over your head. I should probably ask you to leave. Probably." George didn't move. "But before I do, I want you to know something. That woman who lived here before, the one with the kids, I tried to help her. Saw the bruises, heard the fights, called the sheriff a couple times when things got bad. But she was scared. Scared of the boyfriend, scared of losing her kids. She ran before anyone could help." He met Richard's eyes. "I've regretted not doing more ever since. So if those kids are back here, and if they need help, I'd like to be part of the solution this time. Not just a bystander." Richard studied the old man's face, looking for deception, for threat. He saw only tired regret and honest concern. "How do I know you won't call the authorities?" "Because I've seen what the system does to kids like that." George's jaw tightened. "My granddaughter went into foster care 15 years ago. They split her from her brother. Both of them ended up in bad placements. Took years to undo the damage." He shook his head. "Sometimes the system helps. Sometimes it makes things worse. The trick is knowing which way it's going to go before you make the call." Richard made a decision. He opened the door wider. "They're here. 5 of them, ages 4 to 9. Their mother left them here weeks ago. Told them to stay together, promised she'd come back." George nodded slowly, unsurprised. "She in trouble?" "I don't know. Maybe, probably. And the boyfriend?" "Gone, far as I can tell. But the kids are terrified of foster care, of being separated." George was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You have a plan?" "I'm working on one." "You have resources?" "About $50 and some canned goods." George almost smiled. "Then you definitely need help." He pulled a business card from his pocket, worn and bent, but legible. "Used to do construction before I retired. Still have tools. Still know people who owe me favors. That porch is about to collapse and winter's coming. You're going to need repairs." Richard took the card, something like hope flickering in his chest. "Why would you help us?" "Because 40 years ago someone helped me when I needed it. And because those kids deserve better than what they've gotten." George tipped his hat. "I'll come by tomorrow morning." "We'll start with the porch." After George left, Richard closed the door and turned to find all 6 children staring at him. They'd heard everything. Is he going to tell? Iris asked, her voice tight with fear. I don't think so. You don't know for sure. No, Richard admitted. I don't, but I think we have to start trusting someone eventually. We can't do this alone. That night, after the children had finally settled into uneasy sleep, Caleb sat with Richard on the floor, their backs against the wall. Dad, Caleb said quietly, what are we really doing here? I don't know, son. We can't keep them, can we? Richard looked at the 5 sleeping children huddled together in the corner. Simon had his thumb in his mouth. Tyler and Trevor were holding hands, even in sleep. Brooke clutched the silver locket. And Iris had positioned herself on the outside of the group, always protecting, always watching, even now. I don't know, Richard said again. But I know we can't just abandon them. Mom would have kept them, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Richard's throat tightened. She would have. Then that's what we do. Richard looked at his son, 11 years old and already understanding what it meant to choose compassion over convenience. Louise would have been proud. Yeah, Richard said. That's what we do. He just had to figure out how. A week had passed since George's first visit, and the house had begun to transform. True to his word, the old man had shown up the next morning with tools and a pickup truck full of salvaged lumber. He'd brought 2 other men with him, quiet types who asked no questions and worked with the efficiency of people who'd spent their lives fixing things. The porch no longer sagged. The broken window had real glass now, courtesy of George's friend who ran a salvage yard. The roof had been patched in 3 critical spots where rain had been seeping through. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. The children had slowly stopped hiding when the men came to work. Simon now followed George around like a puppy, handing him tools and asking questions in his small, tentative voice. The twins had discovered that one of George's friends kept candy in his pocket and would dole out peppermints for good behavior. Even Iris had begun to relax fractionally, though she still watched every adult with wary calculation. Richard had been exploring the basement, looking for structural issues, when he found it. The space was dank and low-ceilinged, filled with old junk and the smell of mildew. In the far corner, behind a stack of rotting cardboard boxes, he discovered evidence of recent habitation, a stained mattress, empty liquor bottles, cigarette butts ground into the concrete floor, and a letter. It was crumpled, partially torn, and addressed to someone named D. Garrett at this address. Richard smoothed it out carefully, his hands shaking as he read the official letterhead, County Department of Social Services. The letter was dated 6 months prior. It detailed an investigation into neglect involving 5 minor children. The mother, Danielle Garrett, was being given 30 days to comply with a safety plan or face immediate removal of the children from her custody. A follow-up home visit was scheduled. Failure to appear would result in emergency custody action. Richard read it twice, his stomach sinking. This wasn't just a woman who'd made bad choices. This was a mother who'd been trying to protect her children from a system that was bearing down on her. She'd run before they could take her kids away. She'd brought them here, to this forgotten house in a forgotten town, and tried to hide. Then something had happened. She'd left, promising to return. But she never had. Richard climbed back upstairs, the letter clutched in his hand. He found Iris sitting on the front steps, watching George measure boards for the railing. She looked up as he approached, and something in his expression made her face close down defensively. "What is it?" she asked. Richard sat down beside her, the letter feeling like it weighed 10 pounds. "I found something in the basement. I think I need to show you." Iris's eyes went to the paper. "What is it?" "A letter. From Social Services. To your mother." Her face went white. "Let me see it." Richard handed it over, watching as she read. Her lips moved slightly, forming the words. When she finished, she stared at the letter for a long moment, her hands trembling. "I knew," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I knew they were coming. Mama was so scared. She kept saying they were going to take us away, split us up, put us with strangers." Iris looked up at Richard, and for the first time, he saw tears in her eyes. "She tried. She really tried. I know she did. The boyfriend, his name was Keith, he was the problem. Mama kept trying to leave him, but he'd always find us. He'd promise to change, and she'd believe him. Then he'd get mean again. Iris wiped at her eyes angrily. The social worker came to our old apartment 3 times. The last time, Mama heard her tell someone on the phone that we were being removed the next week. That's when we ran. How long were you running? 2 months, maybe 3. We stayed with Mama's friend for a while, then in a motel, then in her car. Then she found this place. Iris's voice cracked. She said it was perfect. Nobody knew about it. Nobody would look for us here. She just needed time to get money together, find us somewhere safe to go. Where did she go to get money? I don't know. She wouldn't say. Just that she knew someone who owed her, and she'd be back in a few days. Iris folded the letter carefully, creasing the edges with precision. It's been almost a month now. Richard put his arm around her shoulders, and for once she didn't pull away. Iris, your mother might not be able to come back. Something might have happened to her, or she might be in a situation where she can't get to you. I know. The words were so quiet he almost missed them. I know she's not coming back. I'm not stupid. You're not stupid. You're the bravest kid I've ever met. Iris was silent for a moment. Then what's going to happen to us? It was the question Richard had been avoiding. The question that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out impossible logistics. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I'm trying to find a way for you to stay together. That's the most important thing, right? Staying together? It's the only thing. Iris's voice was fierce again. We're a family. The 5 of us. We take care of each other. If they split us up... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I'm going to do everything I can to prevent that. How? You don't have any money. You don't even have a job. There was no accusation in her voice, just stark assessment of their reality. How are you going to take care of 5 kids you're not related to? Richard didn't have an answer. She was right on every count. He was broke, unemployed, living in a barely habitable house with his own son to support. Taking on 5 more children was beyond irrational. It was impossible. But looking at Iris's face, at the desperate hope she was trying so hard to hide, Richard knew he was going to try anyway. I'll figure it out, he said. That afternoon, Richard made a decision. He drove to the library in the next town over and spent 2 hours on their public computers, researching foster care requirements, adoption procedures, emergency custody arrangements. The information was overwhelming and discouraging. To become a foster parent, he needed stable income, adequate housing, background checks, home studies, training courses. The process could take months. He didn't have months, but he found one glimmer of possibility: emergency kinship care. If he could prove some familial connection, however distant, the requirements were less stringent. And if he could find someone with legal standing to vouch for the placement, he might have a chance. The problem was, he had no connection to these children. No legal standing whatsoever. He wrote down phone numbers for legal aid organizations, family advocacy groups, anyone who might be able to help. It felt like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. But it was something. When he got back to the house, Diane, from the general store, was sitting on the newly repaired porch with George, drinking coffee from a thermos. The children were in the yard. Caleb had found an old soccer ball somewhere and was teaching them to kick it. Richard, Diane said as he climbed out of the truck. We need to talk. His heart sank. About what? About those kids. She took a sip of coffee, studying him over the rim. George told me what's going on. Don't look at him like that. He was trying to help. And I already knew something was up. You don't buy that much food for 2 people. Richard's mind raced, trying to figure out how much damage this could cause. Diane, I can explain. I don't need explanations. I need to tell you something. She set down her coffee. Those children, the oldest girl. That's Iris Garrett, isn't it? Richard's mouth went dry. How did you... Because I knew her grandfather. Diane's voice softened. Sheriff Paul Garrett. He ran the sheriff's department here for 30 years. Died about 5 years back, heart attack. He was a good man, one of the best I've ever known. Richard felt the ground shift under his feet. The children's grandfather was the sheriff. Their grandmother, too, Dorothy Garrett. She was the elementary school principal. Died 2 years after Paul. Diane looked toward the children playing in the yard. Their daughter Danielle was troubled. Started using drugs after her parents died, fell in with bad people. Paul and Dorothy tried everything to help her, but sometimes love isn't enough. Why didn't anyone look for the children when Danielle disappeared? Because nobody knew where she'd gone. She'd moved out of county before social services started their investigation. By the time anyone thought to look, the trail was cold. Diane stood up. But those kids, they're not just anyone's children. They're Paul Garrett's grandchildren. They have roots here. They belong to this community. Richard stared at her, something like hope beginning to kindle. What are you saying? I'm saying this town failed Paul's family once. We're not going to do it again. The revelation about the children's grandfather changed everything. Over the next few days, Richard watched as the community of Meadowbrook, a town he'd thought was half dead, came quietly to life around them. George brought more than tools. He brought stories. Stories about Sheriff Paul Garrett, who'd helped him through a rough patch when George's wife had died. About Dorothy Garrett, who'd tutored George's grandson every afternoon for free when the boy was struggling with reading. About a couple who'd believed in helping people even when it cost them something. Paul knew his daughter was in trouble, George said one evening, sitting on the porch while the children ate dinner inside. Tried everything to get her clean, get her away from that boyfriend. But addiction's a hard thing, and fear's even harder. He shook his head. If he knew his grandkids ended up here alone, scared, it would have broken what was left of his heart. Richard understood what George wasn't saying. They owed Paul Garrett's memory something. They owed those children a chance. The next morning, Diane showed up with 3 large boxes. "Clothing," she said, hauling them onto the porch. Called around to some of the other families in town. Everybody's got kids' clothes their own have outgrown. Figured these 5 could use them. The children approached the boxes cautiously, unused to gifts, unused to kindness without strings attached. But when Iris pulled out a winter coat that actually fit her, when Simon found a pair of sneakers with cartoon characters on them, when the twins discovered matching hoodies, something shifted. They were still wary, still waiting for the other shoe to drop, but they were also starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone cared. That afternoon, a woman in her 70s knocked on the door. She introduced herself as Mrs. Alvarez, a retired teacher. "I heard Paul Garrett's grandchildren were back in town," she said simply. "I taught their mother when she was young. Before things went wrong." She looked past Richard to where the children were sorting through clothes. "They should be in school, learning. I may be retired, but I still remember how to teach. If you'll allow it, I'd like to come by a few times a week. Give them lessons. Keep their minds sharp." Richard had been worried about exactly this: truancy, the legal requirement for education, the ways the system could use their situation against them. "Mrs. Alvarez, I can't pay you. I'm not asking for payment. I'm asking to help," she smiled. "Besides, teaching is what I do, always has been. And Paul Garrett once talked the school board out of firing me when I made a mistake with the budget. I owed him. Never got to repay that debt. But I can help his grandchildren." By the end of the week, they had a routine. Mrs. Alvarez came every morning at 9, bringing workbooks and pencils, and a patience that seemed endless. She assessed each child's level carefully, creating individualized lessons. Iris was working at a 5th grade level in reading, but struggled with math. The twins needed help with basic phonics. Simon was learning his letters. Brooke could read beautifully but was terrified of speaking out loud. "She's selective mute," Mrs. Alvarez told Richard quietly one day. "Trauma response. She'll talk when she feels safe. We just have to give her time and space." In the afternoons, Richard worked. George had been true to his word about knowing people. He'd connected Richard with various contractors and handymen in the area who needed temporary labor. It wasn't steady work and it didn't pay much, but it was something. Richard repaired fences, painted sheds, helped with roofing projects. Every dollar went toward food, toward making the house more livable, toward the growing list of children who depended on him. Caleb had become essential to the household in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. The boy had taken on the role of big brother with natural ease. He helped Simon tie his shoes every morning, walked the twins through their reading assignments when they got frustrated, sat with Brooke during her quiet times, never pressuring her to speak, just being present. One evening, Richard found Caleb and Iris sitting on the porch steps together, talking in low voices. "Do you miss her?" Iris was asking. "Your mom?" "Every day," Caleb said. "Sometimes I forget she's gone. I'll think of something funny and turn to tell her, and then I remember." He picked at a splinter in the wood. "Does it get easier?" "I don't know. I've never lost someone I loved." Iris's voice was quiet. "I'm scared I'm about to, though. Scared my mama's not coming back. My dad won't let anything bad happen to you." "None of you. How do you know?" "Because he's my dad, and because that's what he does. He doesn't give up on people." Richard turned away before they could see him, his throat tight. That weekend, Richard made a decision. He'd been putting off the inevitable, but he couldn't anymore. He needed legal help, and he needed it from someone who understood the system. He drove to the county seat and found the office of a family law attorney whose name Mrs. Alvarez had given him. The attorney, a woman in her 40s named Patricia Yates, listened to his story with the kind of professional neutrality that came from hearing terrible things every day. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and studied him. "You're in a complicated position, Mr. Brenner. You have 5 children who aren't yours, living with you without any legal authority. If the wrong person finds out, those children will be removed immediately. I know, but you also have something working in your favor. These children have roots in Meadowbrook. Their grandfather was a respected member of the community. That matters." She tapped her pen against her desk. "Have you considered filing for emergency foster care status?" "I don't meet the requirements. No steady income, inadequate housing. Requirements can be waived in emergency situations, especially if there's community support." Patricia pulled out a form. "I'm going to be honest with you. This is a long shot. The system doesn't usually side with people like you. Unemployed, no prior fostering experience, no familial relation. But if we can show that removing these children would cause them harm, that keeping them together is in their best interest, and that the community is invested in their welfare, we might have a chance. What do I need to do?" "First, you need a job. A real one, not just odd jobs. Something stable that shows you can provide." Patricia made notes on a legal pad. "Second, the house needs to pass a basic safety inspection. Not perfect, but livable. Third, we need letters of support from community members. And fourth," she looked up at him, "we need to file before social services finds out about them. Because once they're in the system officially, getting them out is 10 times harder." Richard's chest felt tight. "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Could be weeks, could be days. Depends on whether anyone reports them." She handed him the form. "Fill this out. Get it back to me by next week. I'll do what I can." Outside the office, Richard sat in his truck and stared at the form. Emergency foster care application. It felt both like a lifeline and an impossible dream. His phone rang, a rare occurrence these days. He glanced at the screen. "George, Richard, you need to come home now." Richard's blood went cold. "What happened?" "There's a sheriff's car in your driveway." Richard made the drive back to Meadowbrook in record time, his heart hammering the entire way. When he pulled up to the house, he saw the patrol car parked by the porch. A uniformed officer stood talking to George, who looked tense. Richard climbed out of the truck slowly, his mind racing through scenarios. This was it. Someone had reported them. Social services had been called. The children would be taken, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The officer turned as Richard approached. She was in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and the expression that gave nothing away. Her nameplate read A. Kelsey, Mr. Brenner. She asked, "That's me. I'm Officer Andrea Kelsey with the County Sheriff's Department. I need to talk to you about some children who may be living on this property." Richard felt the ground drop out from under him. "Officer, I can explain." "I'm sure you can." Andrea's expression softened slightly. "But before you do, I want you to know something. I worked under Sheriff Paul Garrett for 3 years before he retired. He trained me, mentored me, taught me what it meant to be a good cop." She glanced toward the house, where Richard could see small faces peering through the window. "When I heard there were children living here, and when I heard their last name was Garrett, I needed to see for myself." She looked back at Richard. "So here I am, and I'm asking you, are Paul Garrett's grandchildren in that house?" Richard made a choice. "Yes," Andrea nodded slowly. "Then we need to talk, all of us. Because this situation is more complicated than you know." They sat around the kitchen table, or what passed for one. George had cobbled it together from scrap wood, and it wobbled if you leaned on it wrong, but it held. Andrea Kelsey sat across from Richard, her uniform somehow making the makeshift kitchen feel even more precarious. The children were in the other room with Caleb, silent and terrified, waiting to see if their worst fears would come true. Andrea pulled out a notebook but didn't open it. "Before we get into the official part of this conversation, I need to tell you what I know. Then you can decide how much you want to tell me." Richard nodded, his jaw tight. 3 weeks ago, I got a call from a woman in the county jail. She wouldn't give her name, but she was crying, saying her children were alone and scared, and she needed someone to check on them. She gave this address." Andrea's voice was steady, professional. "I came out here, searched the property, found no evidence of children. The house was condemned, looked abandoned. I filed a report saying the call was likely a prank, or the caller was confused. You were here." Richard felt sick. "When?" 4 days before you arrived, according to the property records I checked this morning." Andrea leaned forward. "That woman was Danielle Garrett. I didn't know it at the time. She called from someone else's phone, wouldn't identify herself. But after I heard rumors about Garrett kids being back in town, I pulled the jail records. Danielle Garrett was arrested 5 weeks ago in the next county. Drug possession violating a restraining order. She's still there waiting for trial." Richard's mind reeled. "She's in jail? This whole time?" "This whole time. Which means those children have been here alone for at least 5 weeks. Maybe longer." Andrea's voice hardened. "When I searched this property, I was looking for signs of current habitation. I should have been more thorough. Should have checked the crawl spaces, the basement. But the house looked empty, and I had 3 other calls waiting." She met Richard's eyes. "I failed those kids. I'm not going to fail them again. What does that mean? Are you taking them?" "That depends on you." Andrea finally opened her notebook. "Tell me everything. How you found them, what condition they were in, what you've done to help them, and most importantly, what you plan to do now." Richard told her, all of it. Finding the children huddled against the wall, terrified and starving. Iris's notebook with her mother's message. The locket under the floorboards. The social services letter in the basement. The community's response. His plan to file for emergency foster care. Andrea listened without interrupting, taking notes occasionally. When Richard finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You know I should report this immediately," she said finally. "Those children should be in emergency protective custody right now. I know. They should be evaluated by medical professionals, interviewed by social workers, placed in licensed foster homes. I know." Richard's hands clenched on the table. "But you also know what happens next. They get separated. Iris goes to one home, the twins to another. Maybe Brooke and Simon get placed together if they're lucky. They lose each other. They lose the only family they have left." Andrea's jaw tightened. "The system isn't perfect. The system already failed them once. Their mother was so scared of having them taken away that she ran. She chose living in a condemned house over trusting the system to keep her family together." Richard's voice rose, despite his efforts to stay calm. "I'm not saying she made good choices. I'm saying she was desperate. And she was right to be scared, because that's exactly what would have happened. So what's your alternative? You keep them here indefinitely? Hope nobody notices 5 kids who should be in school, who have no legal guardian, who are living with a stranger." "I'm not a stranger anymore." Richard pulled out the emergency foster care application Patricia had given him. "I'm trying to do this right, legally, but I need time." Andrea took the form, scanning it quickly. Her expression was unreadable. "This could take months to process, and that's if it gets approved at all. I know, and in the meantime you're violating about a dozen laws." "I know that too, Andrea set down the form and rubbed her eyes. "Paul Garrett was the best man I ever worked for. He taught me that the law and justice aren't always the same thing. Sometimes you have to choose which one matters more." She looked toward the doorway, where the children were undoubtedly listening. He loved his daughter. Talked about her sometimes when he'd had a rough day. About how he'd failed her somehow, didn't see the signs until it was too late. About how he wished he could have saved her from herself. Her voice dropped. He never knew about these kids. Danielle kept them away from him after she got into drugs. Didn't want him to see what she'd become. He died not knowing he had grandchildren. Richard waited, barely breathing. "I'm going to give you something," Andrea said finally. She reached into her jacket and pulled out an old leather journal, worn and creased. "This belonged to Paul. His wife gave it to me after he died. Said he'd want someone on the force to have it, to remember what kind of cop he was." She opened it to the last page. "Read this." Richard took the journal carefully. The handwriting was neat, measured, the writing of someone who chose his words with precision. The entry was dated a few months before Paul Garrett's death. "I fear for my daughter," it read. "I fear I've lost her to demons I don't know how to fight. I've tried everything: treatment, intervention, tough love, unconditional support. Nothing reaches her. Nothing changes the pattern. My greatest fear is that one day she'll have children and they'll suffer for her choices. If that day comes, if she brings innocence into this world and can't care for them properly, I pray someone will step in. Someone who understands that keeping a family together matters. Someone who won't let the system destroy what's left of the bonds that hold them. If I can't save my daughter, maybe someone else can save her children. That's my prayer. That's my hope. God help them all." Richard's hands shook as he read the words. He looked up at Andrea, who was watching him with an expression that might have been hope or might have been fear, maybe both. Paul Garrett's dying wish was that someone would protect his grandchildren if Danielle couldn't, Andrea said quietly. He wanted them kept together. He wanted them to have a chance. She stood up. "I came here today to do my job, to report neglected children and follow protocol." But after reading that journal again last night, after thinking about what Paul would want, she paused at the doorway. "I'm going to give you 2 weeks. 2 weeks to get that application processed, to make this house passable for an inspection, to prove you can do this. But if I come back and things aren't moving forward, I'll have no choice but to make an official report." Richard stood so quickly his chair scraped the floor. 2 weeks? "That's not enough time. It's what I can give you." Andrea's voice was firm. "And it's more than you'd get from anyone else. Use it wisely." She walked to the door, then turned back. "And Mr. Brenner." Paul Garrett believed in second chances. He believed that good people sometimes ended up in bad situations, and that they deserved help, not judgment. "I think you're a good person in a bad situation. Don't make me regret this." After she left, Richard stood alone in the kitchen, holding Paul Garrett's journal, feeling the weight of a dead man's hope pressing down on him. 2 weeks, 14 days to do what should take months, to turn himself from a desperate, broke stranger into a suitable guardian for 5 traumatized children. Behind him, he heard small footsteps. Eris appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Is she coming back to take us?" she asked. "Not if I can help it," Richard said. "But we have work to do. A lot of work. And not much time." Akris looked at the journal in his hands. "What's that?" "A promise," Richard said. "From your grandfather. One I intend to keep." The next 2 weeks became a blur of frantic activity. Richard had never worked so hard in his life, and that was saying something for a man who'd spent 23 years on a factory floor. George and his friends showed up every morning at dawn. They worked with the kind of focused intensity that came from understanding what was at stake. The house transformed day by day. Walls were patched and painted, floors were reinforced and cleaned, the bathroom was made functional with salvaged fixtures and George's plumbing expertise. One of George's friends, a retired electrician, got the power turned on, running new wiring where the old had rotted through. "County inspector's going to look for basics," George said, consulting a checklist he'd gotten from somewhere. Working plumbing, safe electrical, no structural hazards, adequate sleeping space, fire safety. He looked around the main room, which now had actual furniture. A donated couch, mismatched chairs, a real kitchen table. We're getting there. Richard worked his construction jobs during the day, then came home and worked on the house until he could barely see straight. Caleb helped where he could, and surprisingly, so did the children. Iris proved to have a knack for organization, creating systems for their limited supplies. The twins were excellent at cleaning, working in their synchronized way to scrub floors and wash windows. Even Simon helped, carrying tools and supplies with serious concentration. Mrs. Alvarez continued the children's education, but now she brought something else: documentation. If they're going to approve your foster care application, they'll want proof these children are being properly educated, she explained, showing Richard the detailed lesson plans and progress reports she'd been keeping. I'm documenting everything: reading levels, math skills, social development. It's not official school records, but it's something. Diane had done more than provide clothes. She'd quietly spread the word through Meadowbrook, and people Richard had never met started appearing with donations. A woman brought bedding, actual beds, twin-sized with mattresses that didn't smell like mildew. A retired doctor named Burton came by to give the children informal checkups, declaring them malnourished but otherwise healthy, and leaving vitamin supplements with strict instructions. You need to fatten them up before any official medical exam, he said bluntly. Right now they look like they've been starving, which doesn't help your case. On day 5, Richard received a call from Patricia Yates. I've submitted your emergency foster care application. I've expedited it as much as possible, but these things move slowly. We might not have approval before Officer Kelsey's deadline. What happens if we don't? Then the children go into temporary custody while the application is processed, which defeats the entire purpose. Patricia's voice was firm. So we need a backup plan. I'm reaching out to everyone I know in family services, calling in favors. But Richard, you need to understand, this is unprecedented. Single unemployed father trying to foster 5 unrelated children? The system isn't designed for this. Then the system needs to change. Maybe, but not in 2 weeks. Richard hung up, feeling the weight of impossible odds. That evening, as he sat on the porch watching Caleb teach the children to throw a baseball, Diane appeared with a folder full of papers. Letters of support, she said, handing it to him. I asked people around town to write them. People who remember Paul and Dorothy Garrett. People who believe these kids deserve a chance. Richard opened the folder. There were at least 20 letters, some typed, some handwritten. He read them one by one, his throat getting tighter with each page. George had written about Paul Garrett helping him through his wife's death, and about how helping these children was a way to honor that debt. Mrs. Alvarez wrote about teaching Danielle as a child, about watching her struggle and wishing she could have done more, about this being a second chance to help the family. Diane wrote about Dorothy Garrett's kindness during a hard time in her life, about community responsibility, about how these children belonged in Meadowbrook. Even people Richard had never met had written letters. A pharmacist who'd known Paul, a grocery store clerk who remembered Dorothy, a retired firefighter who'd worked with the sheriff on emergency calls. Each one spoke about the Garrett family's legacy, about what the community owed them, about why these children should stay together. I don't know if it'll be enough, Diane said, but it's something. On day 9, Andrea Kelsey returned. Richard's heart stopped when he saw the patrol car, but she held up her hands as soon as she got out. Just checking in, she said. Not an official visit. She walked through the house, and Richard watched her take in the changes, the working lights, the painted walls, the children's drawings hung on the refrigerator with magnets. In the main room, Mrs. Alvarez was conducting a lesson. All 5 children sat at the table working on math problems. They looked up when Andrea entered, fear flickering across their faces. It's okay, Richard said quickly. Officer Kelsey is just visiting. Andrea knelt down to the children's level. Hi, I'm Andrea. I knew your grandfather. Iris's eyes widened. You knew Grandpa Paul? I did. He taught me a lot about being a good cop, about protecting people who need help. Andrea smiled gently. He would be very proud of how you've taken care of your brothers and sister. Iris's chin trembled. He would. Absolutely. And he'd want you to know that people here remember him. Remember your grandmother, too. You're not alone anymore. After the children returned to their lessons, Andrea pulled Richard outside. You've done good work here. The house is almost passable. But there's something we need to address. She pulled out her phone, showing him an email. Social Services did a routine database check. They found the old case file on Danielle Garrett. Found out she's been in custody for 5 weeks. They're sending someone to investigate. Richard's blood ran cold. When? 3 days from now. They're calling it a wellness check, but we both know what it really is. If they find the children here, living with someone who isn't an approved foster parent, they'll remove them immediately. Your application won't matter. The letters won't matter. They'll go into the system. What do we do? Andrea was quiet for a moment. I'm going to tell you something that could cost me my badge. The caseworker who's coming, her name is Sharon Dunmore. She's by the book, zero flexibility. If she sees those kids here, she'll remove them. She met Richard's eyes. But her visit is scheduled for 10 a.m., 3 days from now. She filed her intended visit with the department. Standard procedure. You're telling me when she's coming. I'm telling you that I have information, and that I believe in Paul Garrett's legacy. Andrea's voice was carefully neutral. What you do with that information is up to you. After she left, Richard stood on the porch, his mind racing. 3 days, 72 hours before a social worker showed up to take the children away, George appeared beside him. Heard part of that. We in trouble. The kind that doesn't have easy answers. What do you need? Richard looked at the old man, at this stranger who'd become an ally, who'd given time and skill and energy to help children he barely knew. All because of a debt to a dead man who'd once shown him kindness. I need a miracle, Richard said. Or at least a way to make the system move faster than it's designed to. Then we better get to work. George pulled out his phone. I know a county commissioner. Owes me a favor from way back. Let me make some calls. That night, Richard gathered everyone. The children, Caleb, George, Diane, Mrs. Alvarez. They sat in the now livable main room, and Richard explained the situation plainly. He didn't sugarcoat it. Didn't pretend everything would be okay. There's a caseworker coming in 3 days, he said. If we don't have approval for foster care by then, they're going to take the children into protective custody. They'll be separated and placed in different homes. Our chance to keep this family together will be gone. Iris's face went white. The twins grabbed each other's hands. Simon climbed into Caleb's lap. Brooke started humming, her anxiety manifesting in that familiar way. But we're not giving up, Richard continued. We have 3 days to make the impossible happen. We have a community that believes in these kids. We have letters of support, documentation of their education and well-being, a house that's been made safe. And we have each other. He looked at each child in turn. I made you a promise. I said we'd stay together. I intend to keep that promise. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Slowly, one by one, they nodded. Okay then, Richard said. Let's get to work. The next 72 hours moved with the strange quality of a dream and a nightmare combined. Richard barely slept. None of them did. George's call to the county commissioner had yielded something, not approval, but attention. The commissioner, a man named Walter Briggs, agreed to personally review Richard's emergency foster care application. I remember Paul Garrett, he'd said over the phone. Good man. His grandkids deserve better than what they've gotten. I'll see what I can do. But seeing what I can do and making it happen were very different things. Patricia Yates called at 6 a.m. on day 1. I got your application moved to the top of the review queue. They're doing an expedited background check on you. Should have results by tonight. And if something comes up, then we're done before we start. Her voice was blunt. Richard, I have to ask, is there anything in your past that could disqualify you? Any arrests, any complaints, anything? No, clean record. Never even had a speeding ticket. Good. That's one hurdle cleared. The next is the home inspection. They're sending someone today at 2 p.m. Not Sharon Dunmore. She's still scheduled for her visit in 3 days. This is a different inspector, part of the foster care evaluation process. Richard looked around the house. It was cleaner than it had ever been, but was it clean enough? Safe enough? Would an inspector see a home or a disaster waiting to happen? "We'll be ready," he said, hoping it was true. The inspector arrived exactly at 2. Her name was Ms. Chen, no relation to Mrs. Alvarez. She clarified immediately, and she had the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen every possible living situation and wasn't easily impressed. She walked through every room with a clipboard, making notes, checked the electrical outlets, tested the water pressure, examined the windows for safety hazards, looked at the sleeping arrangements, the children's room with 3 beds that George had assembled, the small room Richard and Caleb shared. "Where do the other 2 children sleep?" she asked, counting. "Iris and Brooke share a bed," Richard explained. "They prefer it. Separation anxiety," Miss Chen made a note. "Not ideal, but acceptable given the circumstances." She opened cabinets, checked food supplies, examined the first aid kit that Doc Burton had insisted Richard keep stocked. The children sat in the main room with Mrs. Alvarez, pretending to do schoolwork but clearly terrified. Richard could see them sneaking glances at the inspector, their faces tight with fear. Miss Chen asked to speak with each child individually. Richard's stomach knotted as she led Iris into the kitchen, closing the door behind them. He had no idea what she was asking, what Iris was saying. If one wrong word could end everything. 10 minutes later, Iris emerged, pale but composed. Miss Chen called in Tyler next, then Trevor, then Brooke, then Simon. When Simon came out, he went straight to Caleb and buried his face in his brother's. Not brother, Richard reminded himself. But the distinction seemed meaningless now. Shirt Miss Chen reviewed her notes for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she looked up at Richard. "The house meets minimum safety standards for foster care placement. The children appear healthy, adequately fed, and appropriately supervised. They show signs of previous trauma, but are currently in a stable environment." She closed her folder. "I'll submit my report this evening. It's not an approval, but it's not a rejection either. The final decision will depend on your background check and the review board's assessment." After she left, Richard sat on the porch with his head in his hands. One hurdle cleared. So many more to go. That evening, Patricia called again. "Background check came back clean. You're approved on that front. Now we wait for the review board. They're meeting tomorrow morning, emergency session, courtesy of Commissioner Briggs. They'll make their decision by noon. And Sharon Dunmore? Still coming the day after tomorrow. If the board approves you, great. If not," Patricia's voice trailed off. They both knew what "if not" meant. Day 2 dawned grey and cold, the kind of morning that matched Richard's mood. He got the children fed and off to their lessons with Mrs. Alvarez. Tried to work on a repair job for one of George's contractor friends, but found himself unable to concentrate. His phone felt like it weighed 100 pounds, waiting for it to ring. At 11:30 it did. Richard answered so quickly he nearly dropped it. "Hello? Mr. Brenner, this is Commissioner Briggs. I wanted to call you personally with the news." Richard's heart hammered. He couldn't read the man's tone. Was it good news or bad? "The review board met this morning. They reviewed your application, the home inspection report, the letters of support from the community, and the documentation of the children's current welfare." Briggs paused. "This is highly irregular. The board doesn't typically move this fast, and the circumstances of your case are unprecedented." "I understand, sir. However, given the children's connection to Sheriff Garrett, the clear evidence of community support, and the inspector's report that the children are thriving in your care, the board has made a decision." Richard couldn't breathe, couldn't move. "Your application for emergency foster care has been approved. Conditional approval, pending monthly reviews, and ongoing cooperation with social services. But approved nonetheless." The world seemed to tilt. "Approved? Are you serious?" "Completely serious. You'll receive the official paperwork by courier this afternoon." There are conditions. You'll need to complete foster parent training within 6 months, maintain employment, continue the children's education, and cooperate with all scheduled home visits. But as of right now, you are the legal foster parent of Iris, Brooke, Tyler, Trevor, and Simon Garrett. Richard's vision blurred. He realized he was crying. Thank you. Thank you so much. Don't thank me. Thank Paul Garrett for building the kind of legacy that makes people want to fight for his grandchildren. And thank yourself for stepping up when nobody else would. Briggs's voice softened. Good luck, Mr. Brenner. Those kids are lucky to have you. After the call ended, Richard stood in the kitchen, shaking. He walked to the doorway of the main room, where Mrs. Alvarez was reading with the children. They all looked up at him, and he realized his face must have given something away, because Iris stood up slowly, hope and fear warring in her expression. We got it, Richard said, his voice breaking. The foster care approval. We got it. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Iris made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and ran to him. The other children followed, even cautious Brooke, even the twins who were always so careful. They crashed into him in a tangle of arms and tears and relief so profound it was almost painful. Caleb joined the embrace, and Mrs. Alvarez stood watching with tears streaming down her face. We're staying together, Iris asked, her voice muffled against Richard's chest. We're staying together, Richard confirmed. Forever? Richard thought about the conditional approval, the 6-month training requirement, the monthly reviews. Thought about how fragile this victory was, how much work still lay ahead. But he also thought about Paul Garrett's journal entry, about a dying man's prayer for his grandchildren, about a community that had risen to help, about 6 children who'd become 7, who'd become a family against all odds. Forever, he said firmly. I promise. That afternoon the courier arrived with the official paperwork. Richard signed where indicated, his hand steadied despite everything. The documents made it real. He was now the legal guardian of 5 children who'd been strangers 6 weeks ago. But the celebration was tempered by knowledge of what was coming. Sharon Dunmore was still scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning. She didn't know about the approval yet. The paperwork was so fresh, the system probably hadn't updated. She'd come expecting to find a violation, expecting to remove children from an unauthorized placement. Instead, she'd find a licensed foster home. Sharon Dunmore arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, as promised. Richard watched through the window as she parked her sedan. Government-issue grey, spotless, as precise as everything else about her probably was. She emerged wearing a dark suit and carrying a leather portfolio, her expression stern and professional. Richard had his paperwork ready on the kitchen table, the foster care approval, the home inspection report, the letters of support, all organized in neat folders. His hands were steady. He'd spent the night preparing for this moment, but he'd also spent it accepting that even with approval, this woman could still find reasons to doubt him, to question the placement, to make their lives difficult. The knock came sharp and efficient. Richard opened the door. Mr. Brenner. Her voice matched her appearance, clipped, no nonsense. I'm Sharon Dunmore, County Department of Social Services. We spoke on the phone? We did. Please come in. Richard stepped aside, letting her enter. Sharon's eyes swept the interior with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen hundreds of homes. She took in the clean floors, the donated furniture, the children's drawings on the refrigerator. Her expression revealed nothing. I'm here to conduct a welfare check on 5 minor children reported to be living at this address without proper guardianship, she said, pulling papers from her portfolio. The children in question are Iris, Brooke, Tyler, Trevor, and Simon Garrett, whose mother is currently incarcerated and whose whereabouts were unknown until recently. I'm aware of their situation, Richard said calmly. Would you like to see my paperwork? Something flickered in Sharon's expression. Surprise, maybe, that he had paperwork at all. That would be helpful. Richard handed her the folder. She opened it, and he watched her face as she read the emergency foster care approval, dated just yesterday. Her eyebrows rose fractionally, the most emotion he'd seen from her. This was approved yesterday, she said. Not quite a question. That's correct. By the County Review Board. Commissioner Briggs facilitated an emergency session. Sharon flipped through the other documents, the home inspection report, the background check clearance, the educational documentation from Mrs. Alvarez. Her jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. This is highly irregular. Emergency foster care approvals typically take weeks, sometimes months, and background checks alone usually require. I understand the timeline is unusual, but the circumstances were urgent. The children needed immediate placement, and separating them would have caused additional trauma. Richard kept his voice measured. Everything was done according to procedure, just expedited. Sharon looked up at him, and for the first time he saw something other than professional neutrality. Frustration, perhaps, or suspicion. Mr. Brenner, I need to be frank with you. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I've seen people try to game the system, people who think they can bypass protocols because they have connections or community pressure. The welfare of children isn't a popularity contest. I agree completely. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like someone pulled strings to push through an approval that should have been scrutinized more carefully. She gestured at the paperwork. Single unemployed man with 1 child suddenly taking on 5 more? That's not a red flag to you. Richard felt anger flicker but pushed it down. Getting defensive wouldn't help. I'm not unemployed. I have steady work with local contractors. I have community support. And most importantly, these children were living alone in an abandoned house for over a month before I found them. They were starving, terrified, and trying to survive on their own because their 9-year-old sister was doing everything she could to keep them together. The system wasn't helping them. I did. The system wasn't aware they needed help until recently. The system had warning signs months ago. Social services opened an investigation into their mother. She ran because she was terrified you'd separate her children. And she was right to be terrified, wasn't she? Because that's exactly what would have happened. Sharon's expression hardened. Mr. Brenner, I understand you believe you've done something heroic here, but good intentions don't qualify someone to care for traumatized children. These kids need professional oversight, therapeutic intervention, stability. They need family. Richard interrupted. They need to not be ripped apart and sent to 5 different homes. They need someone who sees them as children, not case numbers. I need to interview the children, Sharon said coldly. Separately. Standard protocol. Of course. Richard called toward the other room. Kids, can you come in here, please? The children filed in slowly, Iris leading as always, the others clustered behind her. They'd known this was coming, but knowing didn't make it less frightening. Simon held Caleb's hand tightly. Sharon's expression softened fractionally when she saw them, the first genuine emotion Richard had witnessed. These weren't theoretical children in a case file. They were real, standing in front of her, scared. Hello, she said, her voice gentler now. My name is Sharon. I'm from social services. I need to ask you some questions. It's nothing scary, just checking to make sure you're all okay. Is that all right? The children looked at Richard. He nodded encouragingly. Sharon interviewed each child individually in the kitchen, just as Ms. Chen had done. Richard waited in the main room, watching the closed door, trying not to imagine worst-case scenarios. Beside him, Caleb sat rigid with tension. It'll be okay. Dad, Caleb said, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as Richard. I know, she seems really strict. She has to be. It's her job to protect children. You protected them. You saved them. Richard put his arm around his son. We did it together, buddy. All of us. When Sharon finally emerged after interviewing the last child, her expression was unreadable. She sat across from Richard at the kitchen table and reviewed her notes in silence. Finally, she looked up. The children are clearly bonded to you and to each other. They speak positively about their living situation and their daily routine. They're receiving appropriate education and medical care. The home environment is safe and stable. She paused. However, I have concerns about the speed of this placement and the lack of proper vetting. Richard's stomach sank. Here it came, the bureaucratic objection that would unravel everything. That said, Sharon continued, I also have to acknowledge reality. These children spent weeks living alone in horrific conditions because the system failed to locate them. Their mother is incarcerated with no release date set. They have no other family willing or able to take them. Separating them at this point, after they've begun to heal and bond in this placement, would cause measurable psychological harm. She closed her folder with a decisive snap. I'm recommending that the emergency foster care placement continue, with mandatory monthly reviews for the first 6 months and weekly check-ins for the first month. You'll need to complete foster parent training within 60 days, not 6 months. I'm shortening that timeline. The children will need to be enrolled in formal schooling by next semester or continue with documented homeschooling. And Mr. Brenner, if I see any indication that these children are not receiving adequate care, I will not hesitate to revisit this placement. Are we clear? Richard felt like he could breathe again. Crystal clear. Good. Sharon stood, gathering her papers. At the door, she paused. For what it's worth, Mr. Brenner, what you've done here is remarkable. Not many people would take on what you've taken on. But remarkable doesn't mean easy. The hard part is just beginning. I know. Do you? Because fostering traumatized children isn't like in the movies. They'll have nightmares, behavioral issues, trust problems. They'll test you, push boundaries, struggle with attachment. It's going to be difficult. Richard thought about the past 6 weeks. About finding 5 terrified children in an abandoned house. About stretching $50 to feed 7 people. About lying awake at night wondering if he was doing the right thing or destroying innocent lives through his own inadequacy. It's already been difficult, he said. We'll figure out the rest as we go. Sharon almost smiled. I'll be back next week for the first check-in. Have the children's medical records organized by then. After she left, Richard closed the door and leaned against it. The children emerged from where they'd been waiting in the other room. Is she going to take us away? Simon asked, his voice small. Nobody. We passed. We're okay. For real. Trevor asked. For real. The relief that washed over their faces was almost painful to witness. These children who'd learned not to trust promises, not to believe in good outcomes, were finally allowing themselves to hope. Iris walked up to Richard and did something she'd never done before. She hugged him. Not the desperate, fear-driven embrace from when the approval had come through, but something quieter. Something that felt like trust. Thank you, she whispered. You don't have to thank me. Yes, I do. You could have called the police that first day. You could have let them take us. But you didn't. You chose us. Richard's throat tightened. You're worth choosing. That evening they celebrated. Diane brought a cake from the bakery. Welcome home, written in blue frosting. George and Mrs. Alvarez came by. Doc Burton stopped in with more vitamins and a gruff congratulations. Even Andrea Kelsey came, out of uniform, bringing a bag of groceries and a smile. They ate cake around the kitchen table that George had built. They told stories about the past weeks, the scary moments and the small victories. The children laughed, really laughed, in a way Richard hadn't heard before. As darkness fell and their guests departed, Richard found himself on the porch with Iris. She was looking at the stars, her expression peaceful. I used to make wishes on stars, she said quietly. When we were living in the car, or in that motel, or here in the dark. I'd wish for Mama to come back, wish for things to get better. Wish for someone to help us? Did your wishes come true? Not the way I expected. Mama's still gone. But we have you now. We have Caleb. We have this house and this town and all these people who care. She looked at him. Is it wrong that I'm glad? Even though Mama's not here? It's not wrong. It's human. You can miss your mother and still be grateful for what you have now. Both things can be true, Iris nodded slowly. I think Grandpapa would have liked you. From what everyone says about him, I think he would have approved. Richard thought about the journal entry, about a dying man's prayer. I hope so. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars, and Richard realized something. He'd come to Meadowbrook with nothing, no money, no prospects, no hope. He'd bought a condemned house as a last desperate act, and somehow, impossibly, he'd found a family. 3 months passed like water flowing downstream, sometimes smooth, sometimes turbulent, but always moving forward. Winter arrived in earnest, bringing snow that transformed Meadowbrook into something from a postcard. The house on Sycamore Street once a condemned eyesore, now had smoke curling from its chimney and warm light glowing in the windows. George had helped Richard install proper insulation, and the children's bedroom stayed cozy even on the coldest nights. The sea. Children were enrolled in Meadowbrook Elementary. School. Mrs. Alvarez had prepared them well. Iris tested into 4th grade and immediately became one of the top students. The twins struggled with reading, but had found a special education teacher who worked with them patiently. Brooke joined the school choir. Her humming transformed into actual singing, her voice surprising everyone with its clarity. Simon thrived in kindergarten, making friends with the ease of a child who'd finally learned to feel safe. Richard had steady work now. George had introduced him to enough contractors that he was getting regular calls, construction, repairs, maintenance work. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't pay much, but it was enough. The foster care stipend helped, and the community continued to support them in small, steady ways. On cold evenings, they gathered in the main room around a project that had become their shared creation, a quilt. It had started as Mrs. Alvarez's suggestion, an art project, a way to process their experiences through something tangible. But it had grown into something more. Each person had chosen fabric squares and explained what they represented. Iris had picked deep blue fabric, the color of her grandfather's sheriff uniform, though she'd never seen him wear it. "For the person who wanted us to stay together," she'd said, carefully stitching the edges. Brooke chose sunny yellow. "For the first morning I wasn't scared," she explained in her quiet voice. She spoke more now, in school and at home, though she still hummed when she was nervous. Tyler and Trevor picked matching green squares. "For the grass outside," Trevor said. "We're going to plant a garden in spring," Tyler added. They still finished each other's sentences. Simon's square was bright red, the same color as Caleb's winter jacket. "Because Toby brother is always warm," he said seriously. He'd stopped calling Caleb by his actual name. To Simon, Caleb would always be Toby brother, a title that made Caleb's eyes shine with pride every time he heard it. Caleb chose soft gray, like the house's siding, before George had helped paint it. "For new beginnings," he said. "For taking something broken and making it better." Richard had chosen white, the color of Louise's favorite dress, the one she'd worn on their anniversary every year. "For the person who taught me what family means," he'd told the children, "and for remembering that love doesn't end just because someone's gone." Mrs. Alvarez taught them the stitches, the patterns, how to connect the squares into something whole. The quilt grew slowly, section by section, a map of their journey rendered in fabric and thread. Sharon Dunmore came for her monthly visits, each one less tense than the last. She interviewed the children, inspected the house, reviewed Richard's financial records. She checked off boxes on forms, maintained her professional demeanor, but Richard noticed her expression softening over time. On her 3rd visit, she sat at the kitchen table reviewing paperwork while the children did homework in the other room. "You've completed your foster parent training," she noted, making a mark on her form. "Ahead of schedule. Wanted to make sure everything was in order. The children's school reports are excellent. Their pediatrician says they've gained appropriate weight and show no signs of ongoing neglect." Sharon looked up at him. "You're aware that after 6 months of successful placement, you're eligible to begin adoption proceedings?" Richard's heart skipped. "Adoption? Full legal adoption. It's a lengthy process, requires court approval, home studies, the whole procedure. But given the circumstances, no other family, mother's parental rights likely to be terminated due to her incarceration and the abandonment, you'd have a strong case." She paused. "Have you thought about it?" "Every day," Richard admitted. "But I didn't want to assume. Didn't want to push. You should talk to the children. See what they want." Sharon closed her folder. "For what it's worth, Mr. Brenner, I was skeptical of this placement initially. I thought it was rushed, thought you were in over your head. But you've proven me wrong. These children are thriving. That's not something I see as often as I'd like in this job." After she left, Richard sat with the children that evening and asked them the question that had been weighing on his mind. "How would you feel if we made this permanent?" If I adopted you and you became Brenner's officially? The children exchanged glances. That silent communication they'd perfected. Would we have to change our last name? Iris asked carefully. We're Garretts. That's who Grandpa Paul was. We don't want to lose that. Richard understood immediately. You wouldn't have to change anything you didn't want to change. We could hyphenate Garrett Brenner, or keep Garrett entirely. The name doesn't matter as much as what it means. What does it mean? Brooke asked. It means we're a family, legally, officially, permanently. It means nobody can separate us. It means this is home for real. Simon climbed into Richard's lap. Forever and ever? Forever and ever. Even when we're bad. Richard smiled. Even when you're bad. That's what family means. You're stuck with me. The vote was unanimous. The adoption process began in January. Patricia Yates handled the paperwork, navigating the legal complexities with practiced efficiency. There were court dates, interviews, more home studies. But this time Richard faced it all with confidence. They'd already survived the hardest part. On a cold morning in early March, they stood in a courthouse. Richard, Caleb, and the 5 Garrett children, now wearing their best clothes that Diane had helped them pick out. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, reviewed the case carefully. This is an unusual situation, she said, looking at the family assembled before her. Mr. Brenner, you've taken on a significant responsibility. Yes, Your Honor, the best responsibility of my life. These children have been through trauma. They'll need ongoing support, therapy, patience. We know. We're ready. The judge looked at the children. And you 5, you understand what adoption means? That Mr. Brenner would become your legal father? Iris stood up straight. Yes, Your Honor, we understand. He's already been our father. This just makes it official. The judge smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. Then by the power vested in me by the state, I hereby grant this petition for adoption. The 5 Garrett children are now legally, permanently and irrevocably part of the Brenner family. Congratulations. The courthouse erupted in applause. George was there, and Diane, and Mrs. Alvarez, and Doc Burton, and Andrea Kelsey in her uniform. Even Sharon Dunmore had come, standing in the back, her professional mask finally cracking to reveal genuine pleasure. That evening back home, they finished the quilt. The last square was added, a group effort, all 7 of them working together. It was white, with a simple house stitched in the center, surrounded by 7 stick figures holding hands. For home, Iris said, as she made the final stitch. For all of us. They hung the quilt in the living room. Above the couch, where they gathered for movie nights and homework sessions, and the 1,000 small moments that made up family life. Spring arrived, and with it, the garden that Tyler and Trevor had dreamed about. They planted seeds together, tomatoes, peppers, flowers that would bloom in summer. The children knelt in the dirt with Caleb, learning about growth and patience and how beautiful things could come from careful tending. Richard stood on the porch watching them, thinking about the journey that had brought them here, about a condemned house bought for $100, about 5 terrified children and 1 desperate father, about a community that had remembered what it meant to care. He thought about Louise and about Paul Garrett and about all the people who'd helped them reach this moment. About how love multiplied instead of dividing, how it made room, how it found a way. Simon ran up to the porch, his hands dirty with soil. Dad, look. The tomato seeds are already growing. Dad, not Richard, not Mr. Brenner. Dad, that's great, buddy. Keep watering them. They need sunshine and water and time. Like us? Richard laughed, pulling Simon into a hug despite the dirt. Yeah, like us. As the sun set over Meadowbrook, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Richard Brenner looked at his family, his impossible, beautiful, a chosen family, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Home. He was home, and it was more than enough. It was everything.